Welcome, everybody, and I'm probably going to answer all the wrong questions in this lecture today. I've decided to pre-record it, so I think Matt will be posting some links to some videos, and I've put it into 4 different parts, so we can stop after each part, and if you have questions, we can take a few minutes to clarify those things, because I probably am not talking about all the things you're dying to know about Sundanese gamelan music, which, as most of you know, is very similar to Javanese gamelan music, but is a completely different world. And I hope that these little lectures help you figure out a little bit about that. It looks like Matt has posted the first video, and it is about it's about 12 minutes long, so we'll reconvene. You should get that going, and we'll reconvene here in about 12 minutes for a quick Q&A session. And Matt, please. So what exactly is Sundanese, and how does it relate to Javanese? Although in English we often use Sunda as if it were a place name, it really isn't. It's an adjective, not a place name. So usually the name for the Sundanese area of Java is called something along the lines of Parahyangan, which means the land of the gods, or the abode of the gods. And that's been changed by various overloads at various times to things like Priangan, which is what Mataram called the area, Preanger, which is what the Dutch called the area, and some people use a derivative of Sunda, Pasundan, to refer to this particular area, although that name has some weird connotations because there was a movement after during the revolution to create an independent Sundanese state called Negara Pasundan. So I tend to talk about either Priangan or West Java as the province name, and not to use the word Sunda as a noun, although I know lots of people do. So I should probably start with a brief overview of Sundanese music in general. And to do this, I'll talk about 2 different kinds of music: music for the common people, for the rakyat, and music for aristocrats, menak. Of course, in 21st century West Java, there's not really these class distinctions, although there are certainly financial disparities between people. But most aristocrats, even if they have an aristocratic name, tend to downplay their aristocratic status. And of course, the rakyat have the potential to move up as well. But in colonial times and before that, there were certainly these 2 important different classes of people. So among the rakyat, among the common people, we tend to talk about a few different kinds of music. First, music for agricultural ritual. You're probably familiar with angklung ensembles of various sorts, and those have their roots in these agricultural rituals, music for harvesting rice, basically. There is music for personal entertainment, so you can play a jaw harp called the karinding, various other sort of personal instruments that you can play to kill time. And then rakyat, common men, would tend to, in the old days, go to dance parties where they would dance with professional singer dancers called ronggeng. And one of the kinds of ensembles that accompanied this was ketuk tilu, which involved 3 ketuk, a gong, a rabab, and then the singer dancers. The menak music, the aristocratic music, probably has a lot more comparisons with Javanese music, certainly Javanese gamelan music. There are aristocrats called bupati in West Java, and these historically were the hereditary rulers of small regions who had control of a lot of money and power, and usually pretty nice places to live, and they had extended families to whom they gave aristocratic titles as well. So from the time of Mataram and on, these individuals were called bupati, and the palaces that they live in were called the kabupaten. That was also the name of the administrative district over which they ruled. So in West Java, some of the biggest and most famous kabupaten are Sumedang, Cianjur, Bandung. The courts of the bupati were similar to kraton, but more localized, generally covering a smaller area and not necessarily less rich, but certainly less powerful over a large area. And so the music that they cultivated included gamelan music. So a uniquely Sundanese style of gamelan called degung, which we'll talk about later, as well as Gamelan Selendro, a kind of gamelan based on Javanese court gamelan. And of course, there was a Pelog version of this as well. Another kind of court music that arose in the Kabupaten of Cianjur, but has become pretty well known throughout West Java, was called Cianjuran back in the day, but since independence, it's mostly called Tembang Sunda. This is a style of solo singing that usually involves the accompaniment of a couple of zithers called kecapi and suling, a bamboo flute. The kinds of songs that are sung include the, I'm going to say it the Sundanese way, macapat meters that you've heard Kitsi Emerson and others talk about. In West Java, or in Sundanese, those meters are called pupu more often than macapat. But there's other kinds of poetry and other kinds of songs involved in Tembang Sunda as well. The aristocratic version of dancing with ronggeng was called tayuban, again, a word that you're familiar with if you're familiar with Javanese dance. And as this has eventually morphed into something called tari kursus, and also into wayang wong, a dance drama done with people. Of course, there's wayang as well in West Java. I won't say much about it here. We'll hear a little bit of wayang music, but it's usually wayang golek in West Java, rod puppets rather than shadow puppets, and it's accompanied by usually Gamelan Selendro. There's a very predominant role for the singer, the pasinden, in wayang, as there is currently in Central Java as well. Now, all of these forms have been subject to a certain kind of democratization or post-independence modernization, depending on how you want to characterize it. So some of these innovations include things like diatonic angklung ensembles, which play diatonic music, Western music, or Indonesian keroncong songs or Indonesian patriotic songs using Western harmony. The democratization of degung we'll talk about quite a bit in this, but it involves performances on the radio, and then more recently it becomes a really important part of wedding celebrations. The democratization of Gamelan Selendro, I'm going to say Jaipongan, which is a dance craze from the 1970s and 80s, which has now become almost a classical dance in West Java, but this is a crazy way of playing Gamelan Selendro. Wayang involves these extended techniques with spectacular scenes, spectacular special effects, and often accompanied by extended sets of gamelan, very large sets of gamelan with lots and lots of keys and pots. Now, post-Reformasi, there's been quite a few new hybrids that involve Sundanese music, mixing Sundanese bamboo instruments and other kinds of Sundanese music with popular instruments, with guitars and other sorts of things. One of the most famous and notorious practitioners of this kind of thing is Ismet Ruhimat and his group Samba Sunda. I'm going to start with Gamelan Selendro because it's most similar to Javanese gamelan, as most of you know it. Again, this was probably adopted and adapted by the aristocrats from their Javanese overlords in the 16th century when Mataram gained control of Priangan, and that was the last time that the Sundanese area was a self-contained political unit. Now, there's very little, if any, overlap in repertory with Central Java, but there is some overlap in playing style, musical idioms, and functions of the various instruments. So a Sundanese Gamelan Selendro includes a gong, a kumpul, a kenong, very similar to Javanese gamelan. The Sundanese who love the sound of their language don't just say gong, they say goong to emphasize the ombak, the wave that characterizes gong sounds. There's also an instrument called the jenglong, which appears in some gamelan, which is kind of like kenong, except it's pitched an octave lower, maybe like a panembung or a slentum, something like that, although it's usually hanging gongs or gongs laid in a rack. Kumpul players have an awful lot more freedom in many contexts than the kumpul players in Javanese gamelan. And in fact, things like kenong, katuk, jenglong, they're often left out, just you kind of have to assume their parts in your ear when you listen. Of course, there's metallophones, two saron usually, which frequently play interlocking parts, and the Sundanese call that technique charup. A peking, a higher-pitched saron, and a lower-pitched saron, which you probably know as saron demung, but which Sundanese call a panerus, and it's usually played with a softer mallet and has a kind of a softer sound than a demung. The ensemble is filled out with gambang and rebab. The rebab is very similar to a Javanese rebab, but bigger and louder and a much cooler idiom, frankly. There's no gender, sitar, or suling usually in Gamelan Slendro, but there's almost always a pasindan, a female singer, or several female singers. Not really a gerong per se, a chorus of men, but more often a single man, a wiraswara, who's a male soloist. Now, the musicians, of course, do a lot of vocalizations, and they're particularly fond of doing interlocking vocalizations called sangat. And when they do sing little phrases, it's called alok, which I believe is a word that Central Javanese musicians use as well. One of the real characteristics of Sundanese music is the kendang playing, the drum playing. And there's several uniquely Sundanese styles of playing. There's austere stick drumming for some pieces, which is now fairly uncommon. There's dance drumming, which follows a dance logic rather than a musical logic. The dances don't always have phrase endings at the same times as the music phrases, so the dance pretty much follows what the dancer does. There is a lively kind of hand drumming, which is based on dance drumming, but actually follows musical logic instead, and this is called tapak malam. The setup of the kendang is quite a bit different from Central Javanese gamelan. There's usually one large kendang called the kendang indung, the mother kendang, and that's placed so that one end is on the ground and the other end is raised up. And it's the large head that's placed on the ground, and the player usually ties his feet up in it so that he can press his heel into the skin of the drum and change its pitch. This is a feature that I've noticed that Central Javanese drummers like to make fun of all the time, even though they have to admit it sounds super cool. And they usually have a couple of smaller drums, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it goes on, that are arrayed around the big drum, which they play with their hands using a number of different techniques. Some people also include a crash cymbal or two in their drum kits these days.
All right, we should be back from the first session there, the first video. Does anybody have any questions or comments they would like to jump in with off the bat for Henry?
Yeah, I was just interested in the word pupu that you mentioned. It's interesting that in both Sunda and Bali, it's still used to refer to a particular kind of meter, which in Java, Central Java is called machapad or other terms. But in Java, I think they use the word pupu to refer to just the word for a stanza in any meter. I'm not sure if it's still used that way, but it did used to be. Maybe Kitsi or some others can point out. But that was just one of those areas where Java has stopped using a certain term in its original meaning, but Sunda and Bali have persisted.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. Thanks, Richard, for that. There are other people around who know more about timbang and pupu meters than I do, but they may be able to say more. But I agree. I think there's other things. Someone else has mentioned the word charuk shows up in a Balinese ensemble as well. So this is another one of those strange connections. Kitsi says they still use puppies, but she means poo-poo.
I have a comment. I was actually speaking with my kendang teacher last week, who's a Solanese, that lives outside of Solo. And he indeed, he played a wayang gig. He's a drummer. And he did play like more of the Sundanese style with the angled drum, and you can change the the thing with his foot. And the first thing he did, he just made fun of it, even though he was playing it. And I'm interested in that because the drumming is incredibly cool. Like the first time I heard sort of the Sundanese style drumming, I was like, wow, this is the real stuff. Like, this is so cool. But nobody takes it seriously in Central Java. And I wonder if you could, I don't know, maybe talk about that a little bit. Like, why don't people take it seriously, or why don't they consider it to be like a skill that is worth, going for or trying out, perfecting?
I think that it just comes across as really kampung to a Central Javanese person who's trying to maintain a certain aloosness. And so it just seems like a really crude thing to do, to show your feet off like that, and you have to kind of pull your pants up to do it and all that. So it's just not a refined thing to do, no matter how cool it sounds.
Mas Henry.
Yes, Pat.
Sumarsam. Can you say more about that democratization in the way of, I'm just assuming it would be from the above, from the elite going from the rakyat, and what the rakyat has before the democratization?
Well, so there was, certainly Gamelan was available to villagers, to people who weren't in the aristocratic class. But Dagung was not really available to them until the early to mid 20th century, and I'll say more about that in one of the later lectures. So the idea that Dagung could be played outside the Kabupaten, or outside of the control of the Bupati, was already kind of outrageous until the middle of the 20th century. And then once it got out and it got on the radio station, then it started to sound more Sundanese than sound upper class. So the same thing with Tembang Sunda. Once people started playing it, in hotel lobbies, it started to make people think of their ethnic identity rather than their class identity.
Thanks.
Quite a bit of chat in the chat box. That's really cool.
Oh, yeah.
If anybody wants to jump in with any of that information and make a comment, feel free before we move on to the second of 4 videos.
So there is I was going to mention Banyumas as another sort of a in-between area between Central Java and West Java, and somebody here is confirming a thing that wasn't totally sure of, but I thought I remembered seeing Banyumas drummers also using their foot. And of course, Patwakiti loves to make fun of the foot thing, which doesn't surprise me. And Chris Miller is suggesting that Sundanese style kendang is especially popular in Wayang, which again doesn't surprise me because they're trying to be more lively in Wayang and less refined, I think. And Jody Diamond mentions something which I almost put in the lecture, which is that there was some interchange between some Javanese and Sundanese musicians in the early part of the 20th century, and there was some crossover in repertory. The piece Toropongan is an example of, I can't remember whether it was Sundanese or Javanese to begin with, but it's basically the same piece in both repertories. And Jody mentions Walang Kekek as a possibility. Although I'm not sure, I think that one really, I've heard Sundanese versions of it, we'll put it that way. Maybe, is it time to move on, or?
Yeah, let's watch the second video. So I'm gonna put the link in the box right now.
So in terms of Gamelan Slendro, there you can say Gamelan Pelog and Gamelan Slendro. Gamelan Slendro is the more common of the two, and there's rarely a double gamelan, which includes instruments of both tunings. Usually it's either one or the other. The kinds of pieces that are played on Gamelan Slendro, there's no real agreement on a taxonomy of pieces or a nice taxonomy of colatomic forms that you can use to classify different pieces. But I'm going to mention 3 different types of pieces, which is a mismatch of what various of my teachers have told me, as well as what various Sundanese academics have written. My teachers, by the way, include Undang Sumarna, who is a wonderful musician who's been teaching at UC Santa Cruz for more than 40 years, Otong Rasta from Chimindi, a town close to Bandung, who was a dalang and a very, very interesting musician, Entis Sutisna, who was another musician from the south of Bandung, from Ciwidey, who was well known for being a virtuoso on lots of different instruments. And then finally, Burhan Sukarma, who lives in San Jose and runs the group Pusaka Sunda. I might say a little more about them later. Anyway, that was just by way of saying this is a mishmash of their ideas about different kinds of pieces. So first I'll mention Sakar Alit or Lagu Litik, depending on how you want to say it. They're the same thing. And this category also includes a kind of piece called Rerengongan. These are very simple pieces, simple in terms of their pitch material, but they can expand and contract. They have a regular gong cycle, but this gong cycle can be either very short or very long, and the pitches can be expanded or contracted, similar to the process of changing from Irama 1 to Irama 2, Irama 3, etc. Sundanese musicians call these expansions sawilit, meaning one wheelit, which is a fairly normal presentation, dua wheelit, meaning two wheelit, where everything is twice as long, and then opat wheelit, which is four wheelit. Everything is expanded even more, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about this in a few minutes. A second kind of piece could be called Sakar Ageng or Lagu Gede. These are long pieces with some or many set melodic gestures, not just pitch material. And they're not played too often these days unless they're associated very strongly with a particular context or a particular dance. And then finally there's Lagu Tengahan, pieces that have irregular gong cycles or which don't expand or contract, or that somehow just don't fit very well into the other two categories. The term balungan is not in common usage among the Sundanese musicians I've worked with. The moral equivalent might be patokan, also called pokok. And patokan is a theoretical approach developed at the Government Conservatory in Bandung, primarily in large part by the late Atik Supandi, which identifies the main notes of the piece, the notes that the other musicians keep in mind and use as a framework for realizing their idiomatic parts on whatever instrument they're playing. It's actually more common to call these notes kenong because the kenong actually plays this part in a fairly unembellished way. Now, obviously, musicians need a lot more than just a couple of notes to play their parts. One cycle of these pieces needs to occupy about 8 seconds in sawilit and much, much more than that in dua wilit or opat wilit. So, how do they do it? Well, the first step is to interpolate a pancher, and this is a term most of you know from Javanese gamelan. It's a tone that's inserted. But this is actually a patokan, pokok, or a balungan tone that's inserted between the other pitches and repeated each time you need to put it there. So now they're down to about 4 seconds, and the next step would be to perform a part that's idiomatic for the instrument that leads to the pancher or to the patokan pitch, or sometimes ignores the pancher and goes on to the next patokan pitch, but that's a little more detail than we're going to go into. Now, we're going to look at this piece called Signor and listen to a little bit of that. And so, as you can see from the notation, the main pitches of Signor are there's a gong on the pitch 3, a gong on the pitch 4, and halfway in each gong cycle is pitch 1. And then to create a sawilit version of that, we'll interpolate a pancher 2 in between each one of those pitches. Now, you might notice there's a pitch 4 here, and I'm afraid I have to use the Sundanese cipher system, which unfortunately is at best backwards and at worst sideways to the Javanese system. But hopefully you can kind of keep track just if I tell you that Javanese 6 equals Sundanese 1, Javanese 5 equals Sundanese 2, Javanese 3 equals Sundanese 3, hooray for that, Javanese 2 equals Sundanese 4, and Javanese 1 equals Sundanese 5. Just try to think of a computer algorithm to figure that out. Okay, so then let's listen now to Sinur in Sawilit. This particular example is from a wayang golek performance, and Sawilit tempo is very flexible, especially when it's for wayang and dance accompaniment. And here is a puppet dancing. You won't be able to see it, of course, but you'll know by the drumming and the compressions and expansions of the time frame that it's accompanying a dynamic dance. So hopefully you can hear that each instrument plays idiomatic phrases to end on the kanang note, and that the pasindan, the singers, are doing something very similar. They're singing short melodic phrases that eventually lead to the gong tone and end on the gong tone. Now, opat wilit, 4-wilit, is another option, and this involves doubling the density again. This time we start with a different pancher, a pancher 5 instead of 2, but then we take that 2 and use it as a secondary pancher. So for each of the main melody notes now, we have 3 pancher. And the tempo is slowed down quite a bit as well, so this one phrase takes much longer to complete in opat wilit than it did in sawilit. And the pasindan similarly lengthens her part as well, so that her phrases are still aiming toward the main melody notes, but she has a lot more time to do it, and in fact she repeats words in order to do it. And in this case, she's also mentioning the names of people who were there watching her perform and probably who have given her money, and that's why she's thanking them.
Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask about the second? Maybe I'll start off a question since nobody is in the chat yet. Mine is about the notation there and the differences between that and the Javanese notation that I know. And the numbers, you point out that the numbers don't really line up with the same way that the Javanese do. Do you know where their system came from for at least naming the numbers or naming the notes?
It's a relatively recent thing. A well-known theorist and teacher named Raden Mahyar Anggar Kusumadinata sort of put this system together, and he was among the people who started the conservatory and all of this. And I have a feeling that he was actually trying just to be contrary to the Javanese when he did this. But it's also true that he also invented a system that uses syllables, dami nati la, and these were always reckoned from high to low. So dami nati la would be a slendro representation of that. And so it seemed natural, if you were going in that direction, to start the one high and start the numbering on the high and then to go down to the lower numbers. This is what I think anyway. And since people were not that into Pelog, and when they were into Pelog, they generally only used 5 pitches of it, then the two systems worked out fairly easily for both Slendro and Pelog. I'm not sure that's a very complete answer, and I know there are other people around who have other ideas or may have other theories as well.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions for this section?
Well, may I?
Please.
Just remind me of Pak Mahyar, because when I was a student at ASCII, occasionally he came to Solo to give lectures in ASCII. But my question is, as you know, I am interested in the connection between Kending, Lagu Ageng and some of the Javanese species that has the same name, like Wani Wani, and what else? Paksi Nguwong. We have a Paksi Nguwong, and then Astawa, we have a Subokastowo, and Gunung Sari. And do you have any things making that connections? Which I'm looking at. I'm again looking at it again, and the closest one is Gunung Sari. It's very close to Jogja's Gunung Sari.
Okay, every time I've tried to look at these pieces and try to compare them, I can find virtually no connection, but I'm probably looking at the wrong version of Gunung Sari in that case. The Sundanese Gunung Sari is a very long, very beautiful, one of the longest melodic Sekar Ageng in the Sundanese repertory. And it's one that's still actually used fairly commonly now because it's associated with certain dances. But yeah, no, I was never able to find any connection except the name.
It's not melodic connection. At least I found the ending, the kanong and the kong, is that's exactly the same.
Okay.
So that's one thing. My next question is that the idea of patoan. I'm assuming that would be some kind of a guide how to play, how to sing in the ensemble. Supposedly, if you compose a piece, where do you start?
I think different people start in different places. So some people, I think, actually, when people compose things, they generally don't compose the patokan. They compose a tune, or a song, a melody, and then very often, or by design, the melody fits into an existing set of patokan. Very commonly, that's what happens. And then sometimes they just come up with a different set of patokan to fit the tune. But I don't think anybody starts with starts with the framework like that. They start with a tune, and then get simpler rather than working from the simple to the complex. They work from the complex back to the simple. And then once you've got the patokan, then all the other instrumentalists can figure out what to play that makes sense.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Who is that?
Kathy
That's
Polk.
Absolutely.
Just a couple of things. Do you think it comes from Cirebon or Central Java? Question one. Number two.
Do I think the patokan does or something else?
No, not patokan, but you know, the gamelan slendro and all of those things. So some of the differences, I think, come from the coast rather than direct transfer from Mataram, even though later on Mataram was important. But
so I think there's a lot of what do you call it? A lot of the things in Sundanese music are also there in Cirebonese music and Cirebonese gamelan, including some of these techniques like the patokan technique, etc. So I think Cirebon is a very important source for this as well. And the question, I don't really know what the relationship between Mataram on one hand and Cirebon and Banten were on the other hand. So I'll leave that to you, Kathy. I think you know this much better than I do.
not always good. But anyway, patokan, I mean, it's really the kanongan, but whenever you were in a wayang performance, there was never a kanong, but people would listen for the kanong note. And I always found it, they'd say, wait a second, what song are we playing? Let me listen for the kanong. But there was never a kanong in any of the ensembles, so it's an ideological thing.
Right.
Regarding the numbering in the notes, I thought in the past that the Javanese did not have those numbers, that it was part of the Dutch influence. Certainly within Sunda, it was more dada, parts of the body and things like that were an older way of doing it. But I really think the Sundanese way of thinking about the notes is probably older than Central Java, and Central Java just got more methodical because it had all the Dutch there, maybe.
Right. So as somebody, Mark Perlman, I think, pointed out, having the lower notes have bigger numbers is a certain kind of embodied logic that the Javanese system doesn't really work with. I think that the Kepatihan system was one of the systems that was inspired by a competition that was sponsored by the journal Jawa, and various people tried to come up with notation systems for Javanese gamelan music. And Pat Marsam can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the Kepatihan system was one of those. I don't know if it won or not, but it was one of the systems that was proposed at that time. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know, but I don't think that Sundanese have been using Arabic numbers for really all that long to notate music. So it's a relatively recent thing.
We have a question actually from Chris Miller. You want to jump on, Chris?
Hi, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Henry. So,
Hi, Chris.
Which instruments are playing the panchad?
That's not that easy a question. So,
or are you going to get to that in the next few minutes?
No, actually, I'm not. So it's a good time to answer that question. So it depends on the piece and the context and the wheelit treatment, who is paying attention to the pancher. But what happens, say, for an instrument like the saron, who is doing interlocking parts, they will play a 4 or 8 note pattern that leads up to the pancher, and then a 4 or 8 note pattern that leads up to the next kanong note, and then a 4 or 8 note pattern that leads up to the pancher again, etc. So all of the instruments might be playing the pancher, or at least gesturing toward it in some way. Very often in the same piece, the bonang player would not be playing the pancher. The bonang player would just be focusing on the main pitches of the melody. In the case of Signor, the 1 and the 3 and in the first gong, and then the 1 and the 4 in the second gong. So they might just ignore the pancher and play those other notes. And obviously the kanong, if it was there, as Kathy points out, it's not always there, the kanong would also play the pancher as well as the other notes.
Would it At last, in the Sinuet example you're playing, was there Kanong in that recording?
There is Jenglong in that recording, and I think there's Kanong as well. This is Asep Sunandar's gamelan, which is a very, very, very big gamelan. I mean, very complete gamelan. So it must have probably both Jenglong and Kanong, which would play the same parts, basically.
Yeah.
And they would both be playing all the panchayat. So, okay. Huh.
But remember, they're not coming that often. It's only, in that example, every 4 seconds or so.
But it's way more frequently than Kanong plays in a similar, like irama in a Javanese context.
Right. It's typical for everybody to kind of increase the density of their part rather than to just wait a long time to play. So you very rarely have a Kanong player who is as bored as a Javanese Kanong player.
Sutrisno, did you want to jump in and ask a question or clarification about the political issues?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's very interesting discussions. Hello, Pak Henry.
Hello, Pat.
Yeah, it's very nice to learn from you that a lot of interesting points to be discussed here. I have noted some Central Javanese slang or words which commonly known in Java, perhaps related to istilah that has contradictions meaning in West Java. If I try to compare with the technical reading points in Central Java and West Java, which is high in Central Java, but to be written in West Java from low. And I try to compare with other words that has different meanings. I suspect that there should be some political issue beside that. I don't know what happening during the colonialism era or during the kingdom authorizations when the Mataram kingdom attacked the Western kerajaan in West Java, that other conflicts of understanding language was involved, so that people are trying to bring on their own emotions differently, but different concepts need to be discussed. Perhaps this kind of feeling, not to be known musically, of course, but if you could explain a little bit or can share with us a little bit on this kind of topic, maybe will help for younger generations, at least to understand what the context or musical issues related to historical or political points. Thank you.
Sure. So actually, the Sundanese resentment of the Javanese goes back to Mojapahit. And there's the Battle of Bubat, which was fought when, do I have to pull these out of my head? Hayam Wuruk wanted to marry a Sundanese princess, and what's his name? Gajah Mada convinced him that rather than marrying her, they should make her into a concubine. And this created a huge conflict, and Hayam Wuruk ended up killing the Sundanese king, and the daughter committed suicide. And so the Sundanese have been pissed off ever since by this. Only a couple of years ago, just a couple of years ago, they finally have a Jalan Hayam Wuruk in Bandung, because before that, no one wanted to have a street with that name. And so the resentment, as you point out, takes a number of forms, and there is always this difficult tension among the Sundanese aristocrats about how much they're going to be Javanese, how much they're going to emulate the Javanese, who were their overlords, and then how much they were going to resist and try to maintain a kind of a Sundanese-ness. And I think I can't think of any obvious examples, but this shows up in music as well as in the language examples you point out. I think sometimes the Sundanese deliberately chose the high Javanese word to be the low Sundanese word. But I don't really have any evidence of that. There are people here who know more about Sundanese language than I do. I think I've addressed most of the parts of your question. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. It's very clear information, especially related to traditions. But I would like to also to bring it to the points where, for example, Javanese drum positions you mentioned also earlier, and then in West Java, the lowest is putting down and using the foot to change the sound. And then right now, where the modern era, many of Central Javanese Dalang, East Javanese Dalang using the Sundanese drums and quite popular. Do you think this kind of cross-cultural traditions in relation to the musical traditions can bring the political tension become better and better?
I don't think it's going to hurt. I mean, it's always, people are always stealing music from one another or adapting their music to one another because they like the sound of it. And hopefully, slowly but surely, liking the sound leads to liking the people who make that sound. I'm always hopeful of that kind of thing. And maybe that's what's happening in Java. I'm not sure. I hope so.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks.
Or maybe we should move on to the next video. So I'm going to put the link here.
Now, those of you with a sharp ear might have noticed that the vocalists are not singing in Slendro, but the gamelan is playing in Slendro. So the singers are superimposing a different tone system on top of the Slendro tone system. One term for this in Sundanese music is surupan. Sundanese musicians don't really talk much about patet, but they are very interested in this surupan phenomenon. Basically, it's a number of pelog-like modes, 5-note modes, played along with gamelan slendro, and usually there's 2 or 3 pitches that are in common and 2 or 3 pitches that actually clash with the slendro pitches. In my view, there's 2 main approaches to surupan. One called sorog, sometimes called madenda, and another one called sometimes pelog degung, and I've also heard it called kabongan and mataraman. And there are a number of other terms for surupan as well that impart information about the usage of that surupan, how it relates to slendro. Okay, so most of you know what slendro sounds like, but just in case you've forgotten, I'll use Sundanese ciphers here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, just so you know, Sundanese often use syllables to talk about scales. So they would sing da, mi, na, ti, la. So to make sorog, we're going to keep one slendro interval, and we're going to take the remaining pairs of slendro intervals and divide them differently. Rather than equally into 2 equal slendro steps, we're going to divide them unequally to have a very small step and a very large step. And so I've put this against slendro here, this version of sorog. We're going to start with the flatted 5. Da, mi, na, ti, la. So you hear that 2 of the pitches coincide. Da, mi, na, ti, la. If I play the slendro pitches, it sounds pretty weird. Da, mi, na, ti, la. So there's a real clash going on. So the principle behind pelog degung, or kabongan or mataraman, is basically the same. It's just that the pattern of intervals is different. The slendro interval comes at a different point. So in this particular version of pelog degung, we're going to start on the note that's usually da. Here I've got it aligned with pitch 2 in Sundanese numbers. That would be pitch 5 in Javanese numbers. And so you would sing da, mi, na, ti, la, da. Da, mi, na, ti, la, da. So you can hear that the intervals clash pretty bad when they're played solo like this, but you've noticed it sounds absolutely beautiful when a singer does it with the gamelan playing at full blast. So now here are Sorog and Pelog Degung compared, both compared to Slendro, and you can see how the interval patterns are slightly different. So we were hearing Sorog in the Sinur example, but I'd like now to listen to Kabongan, or as I'm calling it, Pelog Degung or Mataraman, with a song called Adu Manis. And this singer is Chichi Changkerilung. By the way, the genre here is Jaipongan, which is a popular innovation from the 1970s that by now is sort of considered part of the classical repertory, I hate to use that word, of West Java. And the lyrics of this song are about the roots of Jaipongan, which was fairly new when it was recorded. And Jaipongan's history is cast as a combination of various different Sundanese arts, so-called classical dance, ronggeng dancing, pencak silat, and other kinds of art forms. So Jaipongan is meant for dancing, and usually there's a very lively introduction which shows off the gamelan musicians. And then there's a dramatic slowdown to dua wilit, to two wilit, with some quiet gamelan and singing. But the quiet gamelan and singing is punctuated every few seconds by very loud and very rhythmically complex drumming, which increases in density and complexity as the piece goes along. The term adu manis means a sweet conflict or a sweet battle, and it can refer to this pleasant clash of intonations. It can also refer to the combination of all these clashing music and dance styles, maybe even the clash between the loud drumming and the calm gamelan and singing. And also, incidentally, adu manis refers to the romantic relationship between a man and a woman, especially when they're courting.
Jaipongan adu manis, ketuk piring
Now, it is possible to play Sundanese music using a 7-tone pelog tuning. Usually the musicians select 5 tones with which to play, and then play mostly the same pieces and in the same style as they do play gamelan slendro. Since the 1980s, some groups have been using expanded sets of gamelan instruments that include extra keys, as many keys as a total of 10 to the octave, so that the gamelan itself can be played in the various surapan, as well as in slendro and even in some pelog subsets. Getting the tuning just right to do all of these different things acceptably, with acceptable intonation, is quite a project. And it makes my head hurt.
Okay, we are back. That was really cool. I really love that last piece as well. And I agree with Sutras now about the lyrics. It's very cool. Maybe a question to start us off, sort of going off of one of the last things you mentioned about this gamelan that has, potentially up to 10 or 11 keys. I'm curious about the production of gamelan like that. Do you know where Sundanese gamelan are constructed? Is there like a central sort of city or town that produces the gamelan for the Sundanese area? Sort of like, outside of Solo, there's, in Bekongan, there's the gong makers and whatnot. Do you know if there's any particular place?
So there used to be, I'm not sure if it's still there, in Bogor, a gong smithy or a forging place, but I think these days a lot of people actually go to Solonese makers and have their gamelan made by Central Javanese gongsmiths.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. I know the Bogor Gong Factory was there at least as of, when was I? 2013. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not.
Yeah, I think they had stopped making gongs, but they were still making other things, as far as if I'm remembering correctly.
All right. Anybody else want to jump in before we get to the fourth video selection?
It's Chris Miller again. Here, I'll turn my video on. I don't know if are you talking about Kecapi, or are you focusing on gamelan?
I'm focusing on gamelan, so there will be, the next video will be mostly about Dagung.
Dagung, yeah.
And I won't really mention Timbang Sunda or Kecapi at all, although you'll see a little bit of video. But
okay, well, so I'll ask my question now then about I don't know whether this is maybe too much to get into, but what is the relationship between pelog and sorog in a Kecapi Tembang context, and then in gamelan? Like how, and do musicians usually go, will singers sing with both? Do they talk much about how they adjust their intonation or different senses of it?
right. So this is a big topic, but I'll try to cover it really fast. The Timbang Sunda is usually performed with the Kechapis tuned in 3 different tunings, one of which is called Pelog Dagung, or just Pelog, one of which is called Sorog, and those map fairly closely to the systems we were just talking about. And then the third one is Slendro, and usually when the Kechapis are tuned to Slendro, the singer and flute player will play in Sorog or Pelog or Slendro. And so they, in terms of the singers, some singers cross over between Timbang and gamelan, but gamelan singing is really kind of a different sort of art. It's thought to be a different kind of singing, a little less refined or a little less courtly. So you have to be a very good singer to be able to really do that crossover. And some singers have been more successful than others. So Ais Komaria, whom we'll hear in the next video, was able to sort of find a way to do both at a very high level. Another singer, Tati Saleh, the late Tati Saleh, did a lot of singing in both different styles, but I heard some people sort of being a little snooty about her tumbang singing. They didn't really think she was refined enough to do that. But in terms of the intonation, the skills are transferable. It's essentially the same, although there's a lot of subtleties and nuances that people have to pay attention to.
Right. Thanks.
All right, maybe we'll get to the next video.
Okay.
All right.
And let me just warn people that the next video, the last 3 minutes, if you want to shave off some time, that would be the thing to shave off. Just a warning.
All right, thanks for the warning. This is a little bit of a longer style. Oh, Jody has a question if you want to jump into that one, but just to let you know, this is about a 20-minute video, this last one.
Jody's question is whether singers in some styles are held in higher regard than others. And I think that for the most part, the singers of tumbang are held in higher regard. They don't necessarily earn as much money as the singers with gamelan, but it's a classier act, we'll put it that way.
I mean, is that because there's different statuses associated with the music? I mean, is wayang considered more?
It's yeah, the wayang and gamelan is a little more kampung than Timbang Sunda. Timbang Sunda still has this air of high classness, even if not everybody who is involved in it is technically an aristocrat. But it's still a cultivated, cultivated taste.
Is there a lot of crossover, like one singer who can do all of the styles and other singers that specialize in certain styles?
Yeah, some people stick to one or a couple of approaches, and other people are more Catholic in their abilities or what they're willing to do.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I will say that Tati Saleh was a movie star for the Ronggeng movie and those kinds
right.
So it's really not about her singing. It's about her personality, all of those things. And those kinds of things are more popular in wayang, although the dalang always tried to get the women to sit down instead of getting up and dancing in the prelude to Jaipongan. But it's about class. It's about class and it's about money. So if you want to be prissy and stay in a palace, Cianjuran.
Tati Saleh had a pretty fancy house, let me tell you.
Yeah. Well, Ronggeng, always, from Raffles' time on, they talk about them always marrying some bupati and then getting bored with him and going out and dancing again. That's what the Ronggeng tradition is about. And the Ronggeng in wayang is a marriage of Ronggeng and wayang. Dalang started marrying them because they were pulling their audiences away.
If you can't beat them, join them.
Yeah.
All right, shall we go on?
Yeah.
Whew, all those crazy slendro tunings make my head hurt. So let's move on to a rather different sort of gong chime ensemble, of Sundanese gong chime ensemble called Degung. A lot of people frequently call this gamelan degung, following a general trend in Indonesia to call any orchestra that includes mostly melodic percussion a gamelan. We've seen this happen in Bali as well. Degung has possible precedence in an indigenous Sundanese gong chime ensembles of long ago, before Mataram and Javanese control. This is an ensemble meant to show off status and power because of the power of bronze. There are stories of the Bupati allowing the public to hear music as a special treat, Degung music as a special treat, by setting it outside the palace or even on top of the gate between the palace and the town square. And there are also tales of putting Degung music on a barge to entertain an aristocratic fishing party. The basic instrumentation looks familiar, but doesn't look familiar. The basic instrumentation includes a one-row gong chime, which is called bonang, not surprisingly, two multi-keyed metallophones, or saron-type instruments, but with a fairly big range, much larger range than the average Javanese saron. These have a number of names depending on who you talk to. There's a large hanging goong and a suspended tenor range of gongs called jenglong. Dugung got a makeover in the early 20th century when the Bupati of Bandung allowed his Dugung musicians to provide accompaniment for a dance drama, Lutung Kusarum, in Bandung at a conference put on by the Java Institute. To facilitate the dramatic and dance elements, the music director of the Kabupaten, whose name was Pa Idi, added a suling to provide, sort of emotional content, and kendang, drums, so that there could be movement involved in the dance drama. Some of these Kabupaten musicians also found ways to perform Dugung music outside the control of the Bupati, and they went under the name Purbasaka, the very first Dugung group, I suppose. They composed new pieces which sounded similar to the existing pieces so as to avoid conflicts with the Bupati's ownership of the music and of the pieces. Now, these pieces today are called lagu klasik, classical pieces, and they're characterized by asymmetrical non-quadratic forms, by florid melodies. They're led by the bonang, which plays in a very florid style, as well as the suling, which plays in a very florid style, and there's very austere and quiet stick drumming backing the whole thing up. So we're going to listen to a lagu klasik called Pausiun, and this is performed by musicians from the Jugala Studios, recorded by Ernst Heinz in the 1980s. We'll look at notation here. That's notation for the Jenglong part, helpfully provided by Matt Ashworth. And this is only the outline of the required tune. The instrumentalists are each playing an idiomatic version of a much more complex tune with rhythmic gestures as well as melodic gestures. You'll notice that the texture for this kind of music is much more heterophonic than the stratified polyphony of gamelan slendro music. After independence in the 1950s, the Bandung branch of Radio Republik Indonesia, RRI Bandung, hired the Kabupaten musicians to present programs of local music. A soundbite from the classic piece Lajrak even became the station's signature music, their little call thing, which cemented the sound of Dugung in every Sundanese person's consciousness as the sound of Sundaneseness. And so Dugung slowly went from being this aristocratic symbol to being a symbol of Sundaneseness in post-independence West Java. The radio musicians over the decades came up with a variety of innovations to keep the broadcasts interesting. So they composed new classic-style pieces, even extending those forms. They added unison chorus parts to lagu klasik, which they then called rampak sekar, group singing. They adapted the playing techniques of gamelan slendro to the gamelan dugung instruments, And then they could add gamelan-style kawi singing, which is a genre still popular called Dagung Kawi. They also imported repertoire from other kinds of music, not just gamelan slendro, but timbang Sunda as well. And then they came up with the innovation of stringing these various pieces together into long, interesting suites with a lot of variety. Now, by the way, one of the RRE musicians who was active in the 1970s and the 1980s, who played both Dagung and Timbang Sunda on the radio, and who contributed to the development of many of these musical innovations, is now based in San Jose, California. His name is Burhan Sukarma, and you've probably heard his suling playing because he performed literally hundreds of commercial cassettes that are still in wide circulation. There's a few LPs and CDs that were released internationally that also feature Burhan's playing. Since 1986, he's led a Dagung group called Pusaka Sunda here in San Jose, California, and that group has released 3 CDs that include most of these genres I'm talking about, as well as a number of Pat Burhan's own compositions, which really run the gamut of different approaches to composition. Full disclosure, I'm a longtime member of Pusaka Sunda, and we haven't been playing much during the COVID-19 crisis. I hope we will do so again one of these days. So we're going to listen to the last part of the Ernst Heinz recording, the same recording that starts with the Lagu Classic Pausion, but then transitions into a piece called Bungor. This is a patokan piece, which has the notes 4, 5, 4, and 2 as their basis. And in this Sawilit version we're going to listen to, they interpolate a Pancher 1. The song is called Rumbai Bandung, which talks about a kind of bean salad. It actually isn't talking about the salad at all. It's talking about other things, but the food becomes kind of a metaphor, or at least a convenient thing to talk about. And it includes that impossible to pronounce Sundanese vowel, Rumbai Bandung, which is just so characteristic of Sundanese sound. The singer here is Uis Komaria, the late Uis Komaria, who gained a lot of fame in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, not only as a singer, but as an entrepreneur. She was one of the leaders of Jugala Studios. The drummer here is the late Tosin Mokhtar, who was one of the innovators of Tapak Mullum, of this very understated drumming style, and remains one of the best ever. And this recording is nice because it captures a lot of the detail of his drumming. But you'll probably be too distracted to listen to the drumming because you'll be focused on Ibu Uis's beautiful voice.
Hari
Another innovation by more pop-oriented composers such as Koko Koswara and his protege Nano S created pop songs that could be played with dagung or with guitars and keyboards and synthesizers, thus doubling their audiences. So this song is called Cholenak. It's yet another kind of food, this time a kind of a cassava. And the dagung here is beefed up with a number of other instruments, including the kecapi or sitar, which is a plucked zither, as well as rebab instead of suling, which is unusual but not unheard of. The gamelan is more or less playing in gamelan cilindro style to accompany the vocal, but there are occasional arranged unison sections, sometimes that respond to the vocal and sometimes which serve as an interlude. Now, even though the song is really a patokan piece for gamelan dagung, it also has a verse-chorus structure. So it really does straddle international pop music and dagung style. Now, just for fun, here's a pop version with a chordal accompaniment.
More
And just for fun, we might as well end with a rap version of Cholona, which includes gamelan samples in the mix, as well as a variety of other crazy things.
Biasa nggak bisa sarengan, urang tuang colena, raos seger matak sehat karena awan, pengaosna cukup ku 10 perak, pewarugi ngaluarkeun eusi pesa, colena dicocol enak, anu ompong oge terang, mangga geraja rohia, colena belum gadagan. Sundanese. Colena, cocol enak, kaolahan, urang Sunda, ye warisan, kolot baheula, cocol enak, cocol enak, cocol enak, matak seger kanu awak, olahan tina beuyeum, sampederus dibelem, make enten kalapa dicampur jeung gula beurem, yu dulur carobian, sok mangga diraosan, ye colenak anu belembek meuni pedo pisang, katuangan anu atur pangaos namira, anu awak matak jaga tetep bisa tampil mewah, anu kasep, anu gelis, yu sareng Sundanese raosan colenak amis, olahan tirau Sunda, warisan di baheula, nu kedah dijaga waris keneun isuk jaga. Dicocol enak.
All right, we are back, everybody. Those last 3 minutes, how could you miss those? I believe that Richard has a question right off the bat. If you'd like to jump in, Richard.
Henry just answered it.
So Richard's question was regarding archaic Sundanese and whether it's used in Wayang, and I will defer to Kathy Foley here. My understanding is they use plenty of archaic language, but I'm not sure whether it's actually archaic Sundanese or not. And as far as I know, the term kawi, the kind of singing, is not related to kawi, the language. They're just two separate words.
Oh, thanks. I didn't hear your aspirated H at the end.
My aspirations are I have many aspirations, but unfortunately not at the end of Sundanese words.
Thank you, Henry. And I should add, too, that Henry is very modest. He has been playing Javanese music for decades as well. He's an excellent rabab player, gender player, gamelan player, and gatorong singer. And he's our lead demung every time we do a wayang.
Well, thank you, Richard.
I'll just say that the kawi is, some of it's Sanskrit or real kawi, but most of it is sort of muffled up coastal Chiribinese, Javanese, things like that. It's what their grandfathers and great-grandfathers did along the coast.
Thanks, Kathy.
All right. Anybody have any questions? I'll just jump in and say, look what I have here.
Right.
This is a tape that was featured in the video, and somebody actually gifted this to me. Somebody came to one of our shows and gifted me, I don't know, 10 or so different cassette tapes from all over Indonesia. So this is one of them. It's really cool. And this is more
I think that
oh, go ahead.
The Sangkala cassette was one of the ones that was played out of every shop in Bali for many, many years, probably still is. And then in the 90s, another Sundanese musician actually did a note-for-note reconstruction of that, of the Sangkala album, you know, every piece with pretty much the same arrangements, kind of a knockoff cover.
One other sort of, maybe it's not really a question, it's more of a comment, but maybe you have some flavor to add to it, is that like, I really notice when I listen to Sundanese music recordings, like studio recordings, they all have like a very specific Sundanese sort of flavor to the recordings. And I'm not a recording technician, but they're so different than the central Javanese cassette tapes. And just like, the production, like the way that the production sounds. And I wonder, you know, what, like how that sort of evolved to sort of produce that sort of reproducible Sundanese type of recording sound.
I'm not really equipped to answer that. A lot of recordings were made in one studio, the Jugala Studios, which was the Ais Komaria and her husband Gugum Gumbira were the sort of the owners of that, and they were very popular. And I have a feeling that other recording studios probably tried to emulate their sound to maybe get some of their success as well. So I don't know if it was a particular aesthetic choice or it just happened to be that the way that Jugala sounded, and so that became a very popular thing.
Let's see. Christopher has a question. If you'd like to jump in, Chris.
Yeah. So curious about how every classic Dagung piece that I've heard, to use Javanese terms, is like a pelag lima. But then all of the more pop stuff, like all the Sankala, seems to be more in a pelag nyamat, again, to use. So gong on 6, speaking in Javanese terms, on 6 rather than gong on 5 or 1. Is that, that seems, I'm pretty sure that I've heard enough that that's a safe observation, but is it actually more complex than that? Or was there a deliberate shift? Or could you say a little?
I will. There are a lot of pieces in the classic repertory, end on pitch 5 or the Javanese pitch 1, I guess that is. And so that gives it that pelag lima style, like that. The pangkat biasa, the usual pangkat, always outlines that particular mode very carefully. And so there are a lot of classic pieces that are cast that way, but not all. It's probably, maybe even 20% of the repertory uses different gong tones. In terms of the pop songs, songs that end on the note Javanese 6 or Sundanese 1 work really well because it's really easy to use tonic major harmony, tonic subdominant dominant harmony works out really well in that. There's a important note a fourth above and an important note a fourth below, and so that winds up really easy to harmonize using major triads. Now there are quite a few pop songs cast in slightly different modes or in sorog, and they use different chord progressions which don't sound as natural to my Western trained ear, but some of the chord progressions are a little bit strange. But I think that's one of the reasons that those that tonal shift or the difference in patet or difference in mode that you're hearing there. So it's not exclusive, but you're right, they tend that way.
And then another, I guess, tuning related or scale related question. I noticed in the diagram of the photograph of the Dagung instruments, that they had what are they called? What are they called? Are they actually called sorog keys or like the exchange keys? Right. So I think they are actually called sorogan, exchange keys, which is a relatively recent innovation. So that's from I'm going to say the same, the 1980s, around the same time that people started making these gigantic gamelan slendro. Oh, okay.
But in this case, it's usually only just one key, and to change from one mode to the other, you take the key out of the case and put the other one in. So you still only have 5 keys per octave.
Thanks.
Sure.
Mark has a question. Mark Perlman, if you want to jump in.
Henry?
Yes, Mark.
Hello. Hey, great to see a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to know if I understood you correctly, the Dagung Lagu Klasik were classic in style, but were newly composed for use outside of the Kabupaten, so as not to infringe on the Bupati's prerogative. Do we know what the repertoire was like inside the Kabupaten?
I believe that the pieces that were, the old pieces are now part of the repertory as well. So I think the prohibition against playing them fell away fairly quickly as Indonesia democratized in the 30s and 40s.
Thanks.
Moved in that direction. But they composed a lot newer pieces. So some pieces they are attributed to Paidi, and other pieces are attributed to more recent composers.
Thanks.
Kitsy, do you want to jump in with a comment? I just totally agree with Pawakiti there. When I was listening to that piece, I was just like, oh my God, this is incredible. It's so beautiful.
Now, oddly, that's a recording that was made by a Dutch ethnomusicologist rather than one of the recordings made in a studio. And I don't know if it's that sort of, I think he spent a lot of time arranging microphones and, trying to voice things the way that he thought his European listeners would like to hear it. So I have a feeling that part of it is just the quality of the recording, the clarity of the recording.
Is that a full available recording or just that one song?
Sorry, I played two excerpts from a very long cut that was total of about 12 minutes, and there's probably about 60 or 70 minutes of music on that CD that's still available commercially as far as I can tell.
Cool.
May I jump in?
Please, Andrew.
Sure.
Yeah, Henry. Hi, Henry. Great program.
Thanks, Andrew.
That is that album that Matt was wondering about. It was issued on Pan Records, and it still may be available. But correct me if I'm wrong, Henry. I believe it was recorded at Jugala Studios.
It was recorded at Jugala Studios, but I think it was Ernst running the machine. I don't know if it was Jugala's recording equipment.
Okay, now that I don't know.
I don't know either.
Yeah, but I guess I was getting to the point that you were alluding to, and maybe Matt was suggesting that there was a sort of Jugala sound, sort of like Memphis sound maybe, but it's sort of a Jugala studio sound. And I think you've been in the studio, as have I, and I think there's a specific sound that was generated there during its golden years.
It would certainly make a lot of sense, yeah. They, by the way, haven't really released it. I think they're still using the studio for recording, but Jugala themselves is not releasing any recordings and hasn't for quite a while.
Yeah, both of the people that you mentioned are gone now.
Right, but even before that, they had stopped really producing music. It was the Zaman cassette, the age of the cassette. That was a fairly limited time period.
Jessica has a question, if you'd like to jump in, Jessica.
Hi, Henry. Thank you so much.
Hi there.
I just was wondering if you had any comment about the word surupan as it's used, referring to, the kind of like barang miring or miring concept in Javanese music. So I was really interested in this potential connection between surupan and kesurupan, or possession or trance, and if you had any thoughts about poetic or literal connections.
So I was surprised to find out that kesurupan meant falling into a trance. I didn't know that for a long time. But unfortunately, when I was excited about learning that, I didn't bother to try to figure out whether there was a connection or not. So when I saw your question pop up, I suddenly thought, oh, that's something I should have looked into a long time ago, but I don't know. I don't have any idea. Kathy may have some idea.
I mean, I don't know, but I think you have the idea, at least in Wayang, that there are these two pole notes and there's certain characters who don't fit into normal things, and they will go into these alternate things. So it's definitely about being other than normal, slendro kind of movement through the world. And they like that a lot. It's those people, those characters, those sounds that are often valued and very interesting. So it's to be within the world, sometimes hitting on pole notes with the other people, but spending the rest of your time in a sort of alternate universe is what makes characters and stories and other things for the Sundanese rather interesting.
I'll buy that. I wish I'd said that.
Thank you so much, Kathy.
Since I'm in, I'll say one other thing about poo-poo that people were asking earlier. We had an event at my house one time, and I think it was Ben Suharto was there and listening to things, and there was, maybe it was Bandam, or I can't remember who the people who were there, but he was, Ben Suharto was asking why the Balinese and the Sundanese seem more alike to him than Central Java. And I think it was Alang Yusuf from the Palace Cirebon said his explanation was that when Majapahit was falling, there was a large group that was running like hell toward Bali. So they kept turning around and moving more quickly, whereas the other group from Majapahit ran into Pariangan, but they didn't have as large a group of soldiers behind them. So they were going a little bit more slowly, but basically doing the same kind of thing. And therefore, Bali and Sunda were more Majapahit, whereas Central Java became that Islamic divergent and ever-changing palace culture that would tell everybody how to do things, but in Sunda and Bali, they didn't do it right.
Oh, could I ask you one more thing about the Surupan? I was just translating, just put that into Google Translate, and it said it also means drinking. And I was wondering in this context, if there's something about like intoxication, like sacred intoxication in marginalized Islamic context or in pre-Islamic or non-Islamic context, whether you think there's an interesting connection there too.
I'm sorry, I just looked up Surupan on Google Translate and it says twilight. So I'm beginning to think that there's this sort of, it's sort of maybe a word that implies liminality of various sorts.
Yeah.
All right.
It's very much. And of course, drinking and ronggeng and tayub and all of those things, it's all intertwined. The ronggeng tradition and Sintren, the trance dances, are really intertwined as well. You know, it's the older girls who are still playing at the trance things instead of becoming good ladies and perhaps doing the Cianjuran instead of ronggeng type things. But all the ideas are interrelated.
Thanks, everybody.
Does anybody have any last questions for Henry or any comments about the lecture tonight? Feel free to jump in.
I'll ask one about the relationship of Degung and, Cianjuran, Kecapi Suling, or things like that, the repertoire. What are the overlaps and what are the differences in your mind?
So, as you would say, it's all intertwined. So both Degung and Cianjuran or Tembang Sunda were court arts. And so it would make sense that there, especially as these things moved into the 20th century, there would be a kind of an overlap or a tendency to fill one repertory out by borrowing either pieces or ideas from the other. And that just sort of accelerated as people were experimenting in the 50s and 60s and 70s, especially then by adding gamelan slendro ideas in there. So one of the radio station innovations that Borhan Sukarma was involved with was an instrumental version of Tembang Sunda, which is called Kecapi Suling, after the two instruments that are involved. And those pieces very often use gamelan slendro type patokan pieces as their basis. And there was an instrument added, a smaller kecapi, which then played a more gamelan kind of pattern to fill in the notes. So that then became part of Tembang Sunda as well, where people would add these songs onto the end of a Tembang song that they actually called a panambi, an additional song, a lagu extra, that would then fill out the suite. So it goes back and forth, you know, Degung influences Kecapi, and then Kecapi influences Degung, and then they all influence developments in gamelan slendro. I hope that muddies the water enough.
Maybe we have a final question from Julian Drummond. You want to jump on, Julian? I think it's actually something that we've talked about in previous lectures as well.
Hey, so I was just let me move into a different room so I don't get this echo. I was just wondering, is there a Sakatan tradition in West Java or Priangan the same way that there is in Central Java and Cirebon?
There's not really, it's not Sakatan, but there's something called Gong Renteng, which, again, Ernst Heinz, the Dutch ethnomusicologist, had some fanciful theories about that these were, one time he thought the moral equivalent of Sakatan or of a ceremonial gamelan from the Sundanese Kabupaten, but then became artifacts of villages once Majapahit fell, and so that these old instruments were then preserved in the villages. I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but it's a really interesting theory that there were these, you know, ceremonial gamelan, like there still are, as you point out, in Cirebon and in Central Java, but they're mostly village-based rather than palace-based.
The only difference is that, the only difference is that the gamelan renteng is only one row, punang, and Sekaten in Central Java is 2 rows. And that was something that came up when Mark asked me about Sekaten in my lectures, whether the 1 row punang is much older than 2 rows punang.
So I think Richard North has some ideas about these things as well, about 1 row ceremonial gamelan in Cirebon, etc. I don't know if he wants to pipe in, or he's writing comments in the chat if anybody's interested.
I just want to ask you the name. You mentioned Kang Idi.
Pa Idi.
Pa Idi.
Yeah.
I know some of these people. I met them like Mangkoko and Nano and Pak Atik Supandi is my classmate. And but Pak Idi is the rebab player that's still alive in 1970.
I think Pa Idi died much earlier than that. I don't remember the exact date. Max Harrell, who wrote a dissertation about Degung in 1974, I think was not able to interview Pa Idi, but he interviewed people who knew Pa Idi. I think Pa Idi had died sometime quite a long time before that.
Okay.
I think he was, I'm not sure, but I think it was he in the picture who was playing Bonang, and he was already pretty old in the 20s, so.
Thanks.
Yes. So Richard, are you there? Do you have any thoughts on, Richard North, are you there? Do you have any thoughts on, or do you want to say anything about Sekaten or what's it called, Dengung in I guess not. Oh, there he goes.
Hey, sorry.
Hi, everybody. It's just interesting that to me that there's what they call gong sakate in Cirebon, which is basically gamelan sekaten, is single roll also, much like gong renteng and dugung in Sunda or dengung in Cirebon. It's single roll as well, like a lot of older ensembles. But I admittedly don't know much about sekaten in Central Java, but it always looks to me like they're treating it like a single roll instrument, because you have two players, one on each side. One plays his side melody, another one sort of punctuates it almost like a kanong. So I wonder if it's very, very old music and maybe it was single roll at one time. I don't really have a conclusion.
Thanks, Richard. Whoops.
All works.
I don't see any other questions coming in, so maybe we should call it an evening. That was a wonderful lecture. Thank you. I think everybody really enjoyed it, Henry.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt, for inviting me and for all the good stuff you're doing.
Absolutely. Everybody be prepared. We'll hopefully be having a July schedule up for everybody sooner than later. And we look forward to seeing everybody here on Sunday. We are going to be here with Andy McGraw on Sunday, and he's going to be talking a little bit more about some Balinese music topics. So thank you very much, and have a great night, everybody.
Can we all unmute and applaud Henry?
Sure.
You all cancel each other out.
No, we don't.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Henry.
See you next time.
Henry.